Hey everyone, welcome to part 3 of our flow series, which is a series of Mograph and visual effects processes and just more about the how, less about the how to do things, but the why you do things in a project. A lot of people talk about just how to do things, but not so much about the whole process of dealing with clients and revisions and changes and just the general workflow of a project. And this is what me and my buddy Craig are going to try to explore through this series. So if you haven't watched the first two flow movies, you can go to my website, iDesign.com, and you'll look back in the comments. The first one was September 30th, but you can see here we got this first overview by Craig that basically breaks down what our project was, what our challenge was, and a little bit about the overall process. And then in his second part, he goes over how he tracked a bunch of the scenes for this animation in Nuke. So he left off where he tracked the scene in Nuke and basically gave me all the tracking data, and we needed to create this flowing mass of numbers that went through a hallway. And basically this was for a medical app. So basically the client wanted to drive home the fact that, you know, there's data going to be flowing everywhere. Just this flow of information is just going to be permeating throughout all the aspects of the medical process and stuff like that. So our task, or my task for this specific section, was to create this kind of like data flow. Let me close out here. And so the first thing we needed to do is we just grabbed a bunch of stock footage, stock imagery to kind of show the client, to try to pin them down on, all right, well, what exactly do you want this data flow to look like? Because just the word data flow is very subjective. So we pulled a bunch of, you know, images off Google, and so you can see we have a few different reference photos for how we wanted to, or how we could visualize this so-called data flow in this data stream of numbers. So basically the client wanted just a flow of numbers, zeros and ones, to represent binary data and information. And so these are the images we kind of came up with. So we have this nice flowing, streaky kind of flow with these particles, and as well as this just very light, airy kind of flowingness as well as some of these more matrix kind of style, more uniform. But we decided that we really liked this more random flowing kind of organic looking type of data flow. So we started to do a little bit of R&D, and so we have Craig attempted to try to figure out, okay, how do we create this flow? Because there was a few scenes where we actually needed text to be tracked into a scene and then have this text kind of get sucked in to where the iPad or, you know, mobile device or whatever was sitting. So Craig took a few cracks at just some R&D, just so we figured out actually how to do it. It's always good to, before you go into a project, you just start to play around with, okay, how can we actually get this done, and just focus on that, and, you know, have someone just sit and figure out that aspect of how we can actually get this thing done. So here's another portion where you know, we have these what would be the iPad kind of dissolves and floats away and turns into numbers. And so it's always that how do you actually achieve that result? So and also how, you know, we know that we want the iPad device to kind of break up and flow into numbers. So even just the visual aspect of, all right, we need this to look good, obviously, but then there's that whole technical aspect of, well, how the heck do you actually get these things to break up? How do you get the iPad screen to break up and form into and transition into these ones and zeros? So that's always a hard part too, is the technical aspect, and then once you get the technical aspect down, actually making it look good, because obviously this doesn't look all that exciting or very fleshed out as a concept. So, but it's a good starting point just to see how we're going to get this done. So ultimately we ended up agreeing that we were liking this kind of data flow where we had all these particles flowing along this very organic looking spline, and we had a bunch of different elements in it. So not only did we have just the big numbers, we also had some small numbers in here as well. And then if I zoom in here really close, you can see we have really, really tiny ones, and then we just have like tiny particles. So there's layers to this actual particle flow here. As you can see, we have all these cloner objects with small numbers, medium numbers, so they're all separate, and they're all flowing along this spline, and that is being done by using a spline effector. And then we have I made a couple random effectors added just to really be able to fully control by having a few different levels of randomness, so that we have one random effector that creates the randomness on the bigger numbers, and then another random effector for the random position on the smaller elements. And then I also had another random effector that just randomized the movement overall. So this actually has the random mode is set to turbulence with a little bit of animation. So I don't know if this is actually going to play out, but it's going way too fast for this example. But you can kind of see how everything's kind of flowing organically. And if I just turn off, let me turn off some of these guys, and maybe we can see a little bit better. There we go. So you see that I even added, you can see our spline kind of undulating here. And that's because I added a random effector with some animated noise that is set to deform the points on this spline. So we even have some organic movement on the spline itself, that the particles are flowing along using that spline effector. Another nice thing is if I turn off my spline effector, actually that makes everything go away. Hold on. Let's turn that back on. What am I doing here? Let's so okay, here are our numbers here. Let me turn back on the spline effector. There we go. Okay, so if I actually, let me delete the track on the offset here. One thing I want to show you is to get this nice kind of tumbling movement, so our numbers aren't just flowing along the spline, but they also have this kind of tumbling aspect, like it's almost being driven by dynamics. But to have dynamics for all these little particles would be kind of a pain. And I like to have more full control using effectors than dynamics, which is kind of, you have to tweak it a lot to get even close to what you're envisioning in your head. So to control the tumbling, I just used a time effector, and what the time effector does is it adds constant movement, kind of like the time times whatever value in or expression in After Effects, which is super handy. So this just adds some constant motion or constant rotation to our numbers here. So you can see that I have with this time effector, all of these numbers kind of tumbling and rotating along this spline. So when it's actually moving, it looks like everything's kind of tumbling organically. So that time effector really came in handy. And then I just have a plane effector set to spherical to control the scaling up and scaling down, so it's nice and seamless. So we built this, or I built this, and I used the tracked camera that Craig made from Nuke. So he tracked everything in Nuke and then exported out the tracking data as an FBX file. Now I can actually go ahead, let me see if I have this open. I can go ahead and show what that FBX file looks like. So I'm going to go in here, just double click and open this up so you can see what I got from Craig. And it's just this camera. If I zoom in here really closely, you can see all of these little keyframes and on this little motion path. So we have a whole mess of keyframes, but you'll notice that the scene's kind of small. This is a small movement, so if I make a sphere, you can see how big or how small our actual movement is. So one thing that was handy, and I didn't know about this, but if you, and I guess this is for many tracking programs, is once you, depending on what program you're using to track, so like Nuke, and you bring in that file as an FBX into Cinema 4D, sometimes you'll need to actually go into your project settings and scale that project. So we found that taking this target scale to about 75 times the normal scale, so you can see that our scene scaled up a lot bigger. So that's actually more like, this camera is going down a long hallway. So if I make a cube in relation to this actual scene that was scaled up 75 times, this motion path scale-wise looks pretty good in reference to our scene scale in Cinema 4D. So keep that in mind. We did 75 times. I've worked with Maya tracks that I think I only needed to scale the project by like 2. So it all depends. I don't know the specific rationale behind it, or if there's anything quite an exact science to it, but that's just playing around. That's what we found out from. And if you have any questions, you can ask Craig. I don't know how he found out either. But so let's go into, so we got our tracking data and we had our data flow that I created in the other scene. So now I just had to place that data flow into this tracked scene. So let's go into this shot. So I have my data flow in here. Right now I just have the larger numbers on just for viewport speed's sake. And I also have, we're looking through that tracked camera. So you can see, if I go to my top view here, here's the camera. And here I made this just like framework of like the walls here. And it's not exact, just for kind of reference of where to position things, and just so the spline's not looking like it's running into the wall over here or anything like that. And I also used these objects here, so just like a plane for the floor and for the ceiling and all that stuff. It came in handy when we needed to, say, render out a reflection on these objects and then composite, so you had like a little bit of glow showing up on the floor or some shadow showing up on the floor or the sides of the wall or anything. So it really sold that dimension aspect of, these data flow numbers actually living in that scene, because you saw a reflection on the wall, saw a reflection on the floor, saw a little bit of shadowing on the floor, and Craig will show you that in the next piece here. So you're probably wondering why our numbers are all this funky psychedelic colors here. That is, and Craig will actually describe this in the next movie, is when I export this out, or when I render this out, what Nuke can do apparently, and I'm not crazy into Nuke or anything like that. I just basically know that it's like After Effects, only does a heck of a lot more, and uses crazy nodes. But basically what Craig told me is, okay, if you use a Fresnel pass and use these RGB colors, that he can actually use those RGB values to actually control, depending on how that object's facing the camera, the amount of glow. So, and he'll show you this in the next video, but I just wanted to touch why these colors are like this, because they're not actually the colors that actually show up in the final render, but that's why these are colored that way. So we have our big numbers, smaller numbers. We have the dust, little dust particles here, even more particles, a little bit bigger, then medium-sized numbers, and these smaller numbers. And we rendered this out. We're really pumped about it. We had this flowing through the hallway, looking really cool. I'm really happy with how it ended up turning out, because it looked like it stuck in the scene really, really well. And the client said that they didn't think it was flowy enough, and it was really hard because, like I said before, it's such an abstract concept of a data flow. It's not something that lives in nature or forms naturally or anything like that. So a particle flow is all up into interpretation, and that's where these original reference images were used for, is to try to narrow down the client on and pin them down on, well, what is a data flow and what do you want it to look like in this piece. And while we thought this was the coolest option, they wanted to go for something more like this, where it's a little bit more uniform and organized, and you can actually read that it's ones and zeros flowing through the scene. And as a designer, you're like, well, yeah, this works too, but this kind of particle flow is so much more interesting. It's more dynamic, looks like it has a lot more energy, but at the end of the day, it wasn't what the client really wanted. And even though we tried to push back and say, we think this solution is really, really good, all that good stuff, sometimes the client just they know what they want, and you have to make them happy, because at the end of the day, they're the ones that are paying you. And but at the end of the day, we save this version, and we might, when we actually comp in this final cut, that maybe we'll do like a director's cut where we put in the data flow that we actually liked a lot better. So we had to scrap this idea, which really sucked, but that happens all the time, and you have to get over it and just make the client happy, like I said. So we went with more of this kind of treatment, which the client really liked, and I have that right here. So you see we have this more uniform, organized flow going in a very linear way, kind of like a flat sheet of numbers going through the scene. And we made this, I made this by just making a plane, right? So this is just a plane that has a spline wrap that's wrapping around that same spline, just tweaked a little bit to make it a little bit less curvy, a little bit more uniform in its movement, just because when this overlaps on itself, it kind of looks odd if you have it take too tight of a turn around the spline. So I'm going to hide this spline. So all I had to do is clone numbers onto that plane object and clone along its vertexes. So it's the cloner set to object mode. and it's set to random as well because we wanted to randomize the order of the ones and zeros along the vertexes and have everything up vectored right. The one thing I needed to do and why these numbers are under nulls is because when you create a motext object, if I go right, let's see where this guy showed. Let me go into a new scene. Oh, there it is. So if we make a motext object, you can align it middle, left, center, but you'll see that the anchor point is always at the bottom. And what we needed to do was have the ones and zeros have the anchor point. If I change this to 0, we needed that anchor point to be centered. So that's why I have the number under a null that actually has the null as the dead center there. So when I cloned along the vertex, it actually cloned along the middle of the anchor point of all of these numbers. So that took a little bit to figure out to get right. So yeah, so we have this new data flow. The client really loved it, and we made it look really good too. Even though the original idea that we wanted, that we thought was better, didn't work out. And even in instances like this where you're seeing the backside of the curve and the ones and zeros are backwards, we thought that was kind of didn't look very good. But like I said, at the end of the day, we're making the client happy, and whatever they want, we're definitely going to do, and we're going to make it look good. One last thing that I added for the data flow is instead of it just being static numbers flowing along this spline here, I just added a random effector set with a random turbulence noise onto it, and had a little bit of speed here. And if you jack up the modify clone option here, it'll actually randomize between the actual clones here. So I have noise driving which numbers show up on each vertex on that plane here, which was pretty cool, because then it looks more like that matrix kind of, these numbers are changing constantly, and made it look a little bit more interesting in this version of the data flow animation. So then all I needed to do was, so I have my RGB value in the Fresnel channel for the glows on these numbers as well. And then all I needed to do was go and to render out to give to Craig so he can start compositing in Nuke, was just add a motion vector pass. And that was basically all he needed, and we rendered out as OpenEXR. And we had a few different other shots we needed to add this data flow to, all pretty similar. But the hardest part was going so far as, because there was probably 6 or 7 shots that had this data flow stream in it, and originally we got so far down the line that I put all the original data flows in it with the randomness. So this data flow, the first data flow I created, so I already comped all of this flow into those scenes. So the hard part is when you have a client that also has, maybe they have 4 or 5 people that need to give the okay, and that's always the hard part, is communicating with the client, making sure that they're okay with everything once, and sign off on it and then proceed. And sometimes that doesn't even work that way, because you always have some higher ups maybe piping in and saying, well, I don't like that data flow, or so you need to make sure that when you talk to the client, you definitely send them one. So we should have just sent them this one shot, got the okay on that, and got the okay from everyone that needed to give input, because I think what ended up happening is we got the okay from a couple people, And then we proceeded, because we had a very tight deadline. Like, we had 20 something shots to do and track and comp and everything like that in a span of a week. And we had me and 3 other people working on it, Craig included. But I mean, when they decided that they wanted to go with the new data flow, the flatter version, I had to actually go in and take out all the other ones and recomp these ones in, and it was a pain. And it's something we had to just kind of roll with the punches with, and because that set me back, probably a good day of work. But you try to avoid that when working with clients, and sometimes you just can't, because of how fast paced things are, and you get feedback from a few people and they want to give you feedback as fast as possible, and then your heads down on the you're grinding forward and nose down, and you get feedback from someone else that said, well, we don't like this one, we got to change it. And that's just part of it, and just rolling with those punches. And but you always want to work to make sure that you pin them down, and that's why it's important to first get a bunch of reference images. And even though we went with this one and this was part of the original aspect or original concept, they ended up going for this version. So maybe the lesson to learn is to just maybe show fewer options, so your client doesn't say that, oh, well, we really like this other one that's completely different from this one. But you live, you learn, and you learn and put that towards future projects. So now I rendered this out, and I'm gonna toss it to Craig, and he's gonna go over how he composited all of these data flows in Nuke and added the glow. And it's really interesting how he added the glow and got full control over it by using this Fresnel pass with the RGB in the Fresnel. So that was really cool and something I didn't know about. And stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching, guys.